Okay, let's dive into this. 50 million victims. It's a global death toll so massive that our brains honestly struggle to truly process it. So let's anchor it to reality for a second. Up in Montreal, there was a young orphan who lived through this absolute nightmare. He recalled that his father died first. Then his mother passed away the very next day. And before they could even bury their parents, his younger sister joined them. This wasn't an isolated incident. This happened in families all over the world. Just a staggering, sudden erasure of entire households in a matter of days.
So it brings up a really sobering question. Which was deadlier, 4 years of global warfare or an invisible, silent enemy? For 4 brutal years, the First World War utilized machine guns, artillery, and poison gas, resulting in horrifying casualties. Yet, the biological devastation of the 1918 influenza pandemic eventually claimed even more lives than those battlefields. Throughout this explainer, we're going to explore the chronological escalation of this catastrophe. We'll map out exactly how this invisible, silent enemy actually managed to outpace the destruction of a world at war.
Section 1. The silent wartime spread. To really understand this forest fire, we have to look at the initial spark. And that spark ignited in early March at military camp Funston in Kansas. On March 4th, a single cook reported sick during morning roll call. By midday, 100 soldiers were out of training with 40-degree fevers and these terrible coughs. Very, very quickly, the virus multiplied. It was infecting a staggering 10,000 men every single week at just this one camp. Then, the virus basically hitched a ride with the troops. By late March, training camps emptied out as soldiers headed for the major U.S. East Coast ports. Come April, this sudden illness, they were calling it the Flanders flu, was absolutely flooring soldiers on both sides of the trenches in Europe. The massive, urgent scale of military logistics had accidentally become the ultimate super-spreading mechanism.
And the reason for this terrifyingly rapid timeline really comes down to this number right here, 4 million. That is the number of American men prioritized for deployment straight to the front lines. Now, despite this rapid spread of sickness, military leaders basically took zero measures to limit contagion. War was the priority, absolutely not public health. Consequently, the troop transport ships setting sail from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were transformed into floating incubators. During the 8-day crossing to Europe, small platoons of sick men quickly swelled into entire battalions of flu victims.
Section 2. Censorship and Spanish flu.
Now, what's really interesting about this is, if you're wondering why the general public wasn't in a total panic at this point, it's because they simply didn't know. Wartime censorship provided the ultimate cover. It allowed the virus to flourish in absolute secrecy. And because of this censorship, a kind of fascinating misunderstanding happened with the name itself. Like, why do we actually call it the Spanish flu? Well, Spain was neutral during the war, so they didn't have military censors suppressing the news. When their population, and even King Alfonso XIII, fell severely ill, the Spanish press just freely reported on it. Meanwhile, the warring nations were actively hiding massive outbreaks to keep troop morale high. For instance, almost half of all U.S. submarine crews fell ill inside their underwater incubators, and 10% of the British Navy was infected. Yet the public was told absolutely nothing. So the world mistakenly assumed the whole thing originated in Spain. This quote brilliantly captures that official wartime attitude. Sir Arthur Newsham, the head of British Health Services, explicitly stated that the relentless needs of warfare justified the risk of spreading infection. Combat took precedence over containment, period. And this rigid stance was maintained even as armies literally transformed into gigantic clusters of infection. Get this, one artillery brigade lost a third of its troops to the virus in just 48 hours. But the priority was troop morale, so 6 soldiers were quietly sent to the rear just to uphold this whole facade of a healthy military.
Section 3. Mutation and Global Devastation.
So entering the summer of 1918, what was initially a severe, but often survivable flu began spreading worldwide. But as it traveled, it changed. A newly mutated, highly lethal second wave exploded across the globe, utilizing the vast networks of colonial trade routes. Take a moment to just let this number sink in. 2.5 million. That is how many people were slaughtered by the virus across the African continent in less than a year. The virus arrived via cargo and coal ships, docking in ports like Sierra Leone. From there, it followed the rail and river networks built by colonists to extract wealth, quickly crossing jungles and deserts. In South Africa alone, it wiped out 300,000 people at a speed that completely defied understanding. And the devastation certainly wasn't limited to Africa. Over in British India, the virus found a densely populated landscape that was just ripe for infection. Local infrastructure completely broke down. In the Punjab, there were nearly 1 million victims. In Delhi, 1 out of every 2 hospitalized patients died. The death toll was so immense that reserves of wood were entirely exhausted, which made cremation impossible. Waterways were literally forced to carry away the uncremated bodies. An estimated 20 million people died in India alone.
Section 4, the home front overwhelmed. Back in North America and Europe, the home front was about to be entirely overwhelmed. See, unlike seasonal flu, which typically endangers the elderly and young children, this mutated Spanish flu began striking down healthy, young adults in a matter of days. It was turning them cyanotic as their lungs completely failed, and ignoring the reality of the virus had terrifying consequences. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. On September 28, 1918, despite very clear warnings, Philadelphia hosted a massive parade to sell war bonds. 200,000 people packed the streets. Within a single week, the entire hospital system collapsed. Funerals couldn't keep up, and the city was seeing over 650 deaths daily, a skyrocketing spike that brought the community to a complete and utter standstill. For the last couple of weeks, I have been going through a living hell. All I was doing was pronouncing and signing death certificates. That was Dr. Sidney Rosenblatt in Philadelphia. The medical system was totally broken. Cities like Philadelphia actually had to close churches and deploy horse-drawn carts to just roam the streets collecting the dead. They eventually resorted to burying victims in hastily dug mass trenches because they completely ran out of coffins.
Section 5. Masks, Quackery, and Resistance. As this second wave battered the home front, the public and the medical community realized they were completely weaponless against this onslaught. Because science was basically helpless here, doctors resorted to truly desperate measures. They were flying blind. They freely prescribed aspirin, but often in such insanely high doses that it caused toxic overdoses, tragically killing patients instead of saving them. You had eminent professors recommending inhaling or even injecting turpentine. Medical prescriptions for rum and cognac were super popular, as were quinine whiskey cocktails and powerful laxatives. And of course, your classic snake oil salesmen were out there peddling useless pills and syrups to a desperate, terrified public. We also see this fascinating split in how different populations responded to passive defense measures like masks. Out in California, the governor straight up declared mask wearing a patriotic duty, enforcing it with fines and arrests for anybody who resisted. But contrast that with Paris. The French press displayed this surreal optimism, actually wondering if Parisian ladies would agree to disfigure themselves with masks just to protect their lungs. That vanity held out right up until the mid-October peak, when Parisian morgues suddenly overflowed and bodies literally piled up in the streets.
Section 6. Aftermath and herd immunity. On November 11, 1918, the war finally ended. But all those massive armistice celebrations, they provided the perfect crowded environments for the virus to strike yet again, fueling a tragic third wave that reached the most remote corners of the earth. The virus proved inescapable. This 85% right here, that represents the mortality rate in some isolated Alaskan villages. You might wonder, how on earth did it get there? Well, a brief meeting with a fisherman or a dock worker was all it took. In the harsh Alaskan climate, survival meant tight, unventilated, physically close living conditions, and the virus exploited this perfectly. It wiped out nearly entire communities, often leaving behind only a few children who then tragically died of cold or hunger. So the crucial point is that the difference between utter devastation and total survival really came down to strict isolation. We already saw Philadelphia's disastrous 200,000-person parade and the resulting mass graves, but contrast that with American Samoa. Now, the neighboring islands were devastated, but American Samoa enforced a strict, mandatory quarantine for arriving ships and set up shore patrols to prevent illegal landings. Because of this decisive, strict isolation, American Samoa was one of the very few places on Earth entirely spared from the ravages of the Spanish flu. For the rest of the world, though, the virus didn't just end lives. It arguably altered the entire course of world history. In the spring of 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson traveled to Europe for the peace negotiations. In April, he was violently struck down by the flu. His aides noted it left him severely weakened, radically altering his alertness and mental state. The resulting Treaty of Versailles brought Germany to its knees with excessively severe sanctions that many historians believe provided the very pretext for the outbreak of the Second World War. By the time the virus had finally come full circle, humanity had survived. But not because of breakthrough drugs or vaccines. We survived through herd immunity. The virus simply ran out of vulnerable victims to infect.
But let's be incredibly clear about what that actually meant back in 1918. This natural immunity was achieved at the horrific cost of 50 million human lives. It was a deeply, deeply bittersweet victory for humanity.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. The 1918 virus was actually never fully eradicated. It simply went dormant. It perpetually remains on the move and threatens to wake. Understanding this history, through the data and the tragic stories of those who lived it, isn't just an exercise in looking backward. It's a warning. After seeing exactly how fast an invisible enemy can exploit our global connections, it forces us to ask, are we truly prepared for when it, or something like it, wakes again? Thank you so much for learning with me today. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.